You've probably heard the news that Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia have been liquidated, is the term they use. Back in April, the court ruled that Jehovah's Witnesses were extremists and their activities were banned throughout the Russian Federation. But the Watchtower appealed that decision, but then in June, the Supreme Court upheld the decision. So now Jehovah's Witnesses are just banned. They're illegal. All of their activities are under ban. They cannot meet together. They cannot preach publicly. And all of their properties have been seized or in foreclosure or whatever. They're being dissolved. They can no longer be used for the purpose of meeting together, or the administrative center, the branch office in Russia, is no more. Of course, this is really nothing new for the long-suffering Russians. Jehovah's Witnesses had been under ban, of course, throughout the vast Soviet Union from its inception, and only regained their freedom after the fall of the USSR in the early 90s. And Jehovah's Witnesses gained legal recognition, and over these past 25 years have grown considerably, almost 200,000 who call themselves Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia. The ban has been coming, though, for some time. Russia has the distinction of being the only country in the world that has banned jw.org from being accessed on the internet within the Russian Federation. And that happened a couple of years ago. At any rate, this development poses a problem for the Watchtower. Not simply the situation in Russia, but as regards their teaching, really that encompasses everything prophetic connected to 1914. According to the Watchtower, Jehovah's Witnesses, or the Bible students as they were called back then, were released from bondage to Babylon the Great in 1919. And ever since then, false religion cannot impose any impediments or restrictions upon pure worship. In fact, the October 2017 Watchtower, under an article entitled "The Crown and the Chariot," something of that nature, it said that in 1919, the Bible students were released from Babylon the Great, and true worship is unstoppable. The expansion of true worship is unstoppable. Well, it would be good to stop and think for a moment. What has happened in Russia if the work has not been stopped? What has happened? Is true worship going to continue to expand? Well, we'll wait and see, but it seems highly unlikely. For those who wish to carry on, they'll have to do so underground and at risk of imprisonment. Also, it's come to light that prior to this new ban, Jehovah's Witnesses had been allowed to seek alternative service instead of going into the military. But now that provision has been revoked. So now young men face the prospect of automatic imprisonment, or else violate their neutrality and join the army or the military, or whatever. But that's the dilemma that the leadership of Jehovah's Witnesses are facing. They carry on this notion that false religion, and let's be clear, obviously, the Russian Orthodox Church is behind this recent ban on Jehovah's Witnesses. It's ironic because the Russian Orthodox Church was also repressed during the communist era, and churches were confiscated and burned down some. But it's interesting, Vladimir Putin was secretly baptized as a Russian Orthodox during the communist era. So now he is a staunch supporter of the resurgent Russian Orthodox religion. And it views Jehovah's Witnesses as a competitor, along with other religions. But Jehovah's Witnesses more prominently because of their public presence in preaching. So don't fool yourself. This is religious repression, and it flies in the face of what Jehovah's Witnesses have been taught. Besides the fact that, Jehovah's Witnesses have really no presence in many Islamic countries. They're illegal. They virtually have no presence, as I say. And that would technically be part of Babylon the Great, the world empire of false religion. But we'll set that aside and look at Russia, because Russia is supposedly a Christian nation, and Jehovah's Witnesses have more of a presence in those nations which accept the Bible. And by the way, the Russian courts are considering whether to ban the New World Translation as an extremist Bible. So another factor to consider. Think for a moment, though, what is entailed in getting out of Babylon the Great. The Watchtower, up until a couple of years ago, they recognized that when the Jews went into captivity to Babylon, that it was a punishment from God. And they felt that they came up with this interpretation that the Bible students had offended God back during World War II. They didn't have a clear view of neutrality, and the Watchtower compromised on the book, The Finished Mystery of God. They removed a few offending paragraphs that were considered subversive. And then, of course, Rutherford and 7 other Watchtower officers went to the Atlanta Penitentiary, and that was extrapolated to mean that they had been sold off into Babylon. And apparently the clergy were behind the government push to shut the Watchtower down. Well, a couple of years ago, the Watchtower revised that. And now it seems that all Christianity went into captivity to Babylon the Great back in the 2nd century. That's when, of course, men began falling away from the faith, and this apostasy began to creep in. And then it was really consummated in the 3rd century, 4th century, when Constantine basically inserted himself as the head of the Christian congregation. He was the final arbiter of what was the true nature of Jesus. And he decided, the Roman emperor decided, that Jesus was of the same substance as God. And of course, years later, the Trinity emerged from that confusion. But here's the problem. According to the Watchtower's latest interpretation, Christians had been in captivity to Babylon the Great for 1,800 years. And then in 1919, they were released. Well, that presents a problem, because in Isaiah, when Jehovah repurchased the Jews from Babylon, in the 54th chapter of Isaiah, speaking to his woman, he said, "For a brief moment, I closed my eyes. I turned my face from you. I was indignant for a brief moment, and so I sold you into captivity. A brief moment. It turned out to be 70 years. That was the brief moment of God's indignation. Hardly compares with 1,800 years. But of course, Isaiah is really speaking about the coming of Christ and the release of his people. In fact, when Babylon was overthrown by Cyrus, the prophecy of Isaiah calls him by name. Jehovah calls him my servant, but he also calls him my anointed one, literally my Christ. So we recognize that Cyrus prefigured Jesus. And at the coming of Christ, he will find his people in captivity to the greater Babylon. Well, of course, the Watchtower has an answer for that. Christ came in 1914. And everything is tied to that, isn't it? Well, the Watchtower, I have to say, does not have a very clear understanding of the things to come. Babylon, ancient Babylon, being one of the world powers that are part of the composite beast of Revelation and, of course, of the beast in Daniel, it prefigures the last king, the eighth king. And it's in Revelation, the 17th chapter, that this eighth king emerges from an abyss with the harlot seated upon it. And that beast goes off to make war and to fight against God's people. And according to other chapters in Revelation, the 11th chapter, the 13th chapter, it conquers God's people. And Jehovah's Witnesses don't really fully appreciate what this entails. For one thing, the eighth king has not emerged on the world scene yet. The Watchtower claims that the League of Nations was the eighth king. They can't explain how it is that the Bible says it will put under compulsion all persons. No one will be able to buy or sell unless they have the mark of this beast. Well, the League of Nations was virtually a powerless institution. It had no authority. America wasn't even a member of the League. So it's unexplainable. And right now, of course, the Watchtower has the luxury of not having to explain it. But thinking persons ought to consider the fact that the United Nations and its successor, the League, they're really, for the most part, impotent. The League certainly was, and the United Nations is as well. And why? Because nationalism still holds the power. But it's not always going to be that way. There's a definite trend in the world for a supranational government to override national governments, national sovereignty. And that's what this eighth king is all about, because in Revelation it says that all of the kings of the earth, represented as 10, give their power and authority to the wild beast, that it may rule for 1 hour. So look at the so-called European Union. All these nations of Europe, they consider themselves sovereign, independent, but they're no longer sovereign nations. There is a bureaucracy in Brussels which decides policy, and every independent nation is required to follow the dictates of Brussels. And we've really seen how that has come to the fore in the case of immigration. Because of the wars that NATO has sponsored in the Middle East, millions of people from North Africa and the Middle East have flooded into Europe. And some nations have tried to close their borders to prevent this onslaught of refugees. And that's not allowed. Brussels overrides the national sovereignty and says, no, you must do as we say. You can't establish your own rules and laws. Your borders mean nothing. So we see that is the tendency of the empire to override national sovereignty. And at some point we may expect national sovereignty to be completely submerged and subservient. And a supranational world government will emerge, likely in the form of the United Nations, but we can expect, in order to bring that about, that the system will have to crash, economic, financial system, and the nations will be made subservient to whoever holds the gold at the end, or cryptocurrency seems to be where they're going now, and they'll set up a new system, a new financial system, and it will not be administered by nations any longer. And again, we see that with the euro. Nations do not have control over their finances. They have to establish their budgets according to what the bankers in Brussels say. So we see where this is going. Presently, nations protect the rights of individuals. Russia has not seen fit to do that, and they show no indication of bowing to public pressure. And by the way, this has been well publicized, and the United States government has officially spoken out against the repression of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia, be that as it may. What happens when the United States collapses? And that's what the prophecies point to, the death stroke upon the wild beast. The Watchtower says that happened during World War I, but can provide no evidence that Great Britain or the United States suffered anything like a collapse. You know, the United States was only in World War I for about a year. They stayed out until 1917, and once they entered the war, that turned the tide, and it was over in a little more than a year. Britain lost appalling numbers of men, millions, as did Germany and France. Not so much the United States, I think 50,000. So that's a lot of men, but that's about the same number who were killed in the Vietnam War. There was no unrest. Life went on. The death stroke upon the beast is something in the future. It signifies the crash of the leading country in the world, the United States. And we might as well throw Great Britain in there, the Anglo-American power. And from the ashes of that collapse comes this eighth king with the harlot on its back. And we may expect Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide to be under ban and repressed, to be illegal, just as they now are in Russia. We might think that what has happened in Russia is really a preview of what is to come. Remember, Babylon first attacked Judah some 10 years before the final onslaught. In fact, Ezekiel was a captive in Babylon when he wrote his prophecy. Jehovah gave him visions of what was happening in Jerusalem. And he heard the news when Jerusalem finally fell. But he was in Babylon, along with Daniel. So that was the first wave where Nebuchadnezzar came and he took the princes and the educated class and he took them off to Babylon. And Jehovah still gave the Jews an opportunity to repent But they didn't, did they? It's similar now. The Watchtower is like the Jews whom Jeremiah described as saying, there's peace, there's peace. Peace between us and God. And Jehovah said they've treated the breakdown of my people lightly. And they keep saying, the temple of Jehovah, the temple of Jehovah, they are. They felt overconfident, likely, because when the Assyrian king came up against Judah, he conquered various cities. He'd already taken the 10 tribes into captivity. And his spokesman, Rabshakeh, said, what gods of the nations have been able to prevent us from conquering them? Even Jehovah has told us to conquer you. And how could they argue with that? Because the 10 tribes had been taken at Jehovah's order. But when the Assyrians came up against Jerusalem, and Hezekiah supplicated Jehovah, Jehovah responded, sent his angel, and took care of the Assyrian army. 150 years later, though, it wasn't to be repeated. But the Jews probably thought that Jerusalem was Jehovah's charmed city. It was where he placed his name. That's where the beautiful temple was, the pure worship, to borrow a phrase. But that's why Jehovah said, do not say the temple of Jehovah. They weren't trusting in Jehovah. They were trusting in this visible organization. And of course, God did not protect Jerusalem. The next time Nebuchadnezzar came, the city was completely destroyed and nearly all the Jews were dragged off to captivity in Babylon. And that is a foreshadow of what is to come with the onslaught of this 8th king, a great tempest from out of the north. So anyway, interesting things going on in the world. President Trump was strong-armed into signing new sanctions against Russia. It seems Russia's in the news a lot. Huh? And these new sanctions are basically a declaration of war upon Russia. Financial war, they call it. But, World War II started the same way. The United States put an embargo upon Japan. And Japan was forced, they felt, to attack the United States at Pearl Harbor. And we know how that played out. But we're on the edge of something huge, a great war and disruption. And at that point, Jehovah's Witnesses will find themselves in a whole new situation. Thanks for watching.